Well, thank you all for joining us for tonight's webinar, Witches, Representations and Retellings. I'm Greg Berry, Director in the Office of Alumni Affairs. Since we're virtual tonight, please excuse any technical issues, glitches, or anything like that that we may experience. Also, if you have issues with video or audio, click the reconnect button on your screen to get back to the webinar quickly. We are recording tonight's webinar. A replay will be made available on our website tomorrow. Tonight, we'll be led through an analysis of witch narrative literary works with Aparna Dwivedi. Aparna has been a full-time instructor in the Department of English since 2016. She earned her BA from the University of Delhi in English and Master of Arts in English with a focus on post-colonial writings, also from the University of Delhi. Additionally, she earned an MA from the University of Illinois at Chicago in English while concentrating in women's studies and post-colonial fiction. At this time, I would like to officially welcome Aparna. So glad to have you. We've had this on the books for quite some time, and I'm looking forward to this semi-Halloween treat tonight. So at this point, I'm going to turn things over to you.
Hi, everyone. Give me a second while I get the window right. Here we go. I want to welcome all of you to this webinar. And while we're not at the Oscars or anything, I do want to express my gratitude to a few people. I want to thank the National Alumni Society at UAP. I want to thank Greg Berry for putting it all together. I especially want to thank my students from the past several years who have contributed to the making of this course, which I think I'm in the 5th year of teaching. It is always a joy, and the students contribute so much to the class and keep me motivated to getting more information and changing it from one semester to the next. So before, I hope everyone can see the screen, and let's start. Chances are you have decided on your Halloween costume, or you're in the process of deciding your Halloween costume. Chances are you would have done a quick Google search to see what's popular this year. And if you did that, and I do have a hyperlink here, which lists the top costumes for 2022, and right on top is witches. Witches are seconded by Spider-Man. I would have never made the connection, but we have apparently beaten Spider-Man to topping the list of costumes this Halloween season. Which costumes have ranked on the list of most popular Halloween costumes for adults, children, and even pets? This is coming from the National Retail Federation. There are popular television shows, which you probably know more about than I do, but Bewitched, Buffy the Vampire Slayer, Angel, Sabrina the Teenage Witch, Charm, all of them show a sensationalized type of witch. Of particular interest, and I always find it fascinating when I see these signs, are those that say witch crossing or parking for witches only, all others will be told. It never fails to bring the smile out of me. But in addition to that, or not only from the popularity of witches, what we have been told, or what we have learned over time, is this image of a witch in a pointy hat, usually wearing black clothes, flying around on broomsticks. My own favorite is that their favorite snack is a nice juicy baby. They are purveyors of potions, curses, and general malevolence. They are the archetype of fairy tale villains. Above all, they practice magic. They lived, and when we say they, we are largely talking about women, particularly older women, because 85% of those accused were women. They lived on the periphery of society and quite literally were taking the blame for all things that went wrong. And this is historically. And the things that could go wrong could range from the failure of crops to the milklessness of cows, to the impotence of men, it was always their fault. And this was the kind of narrative contraption within which the historical and literary construct of the witch took place. My own interest in witches comes more from the perspective, with the background in literature, comes more from the perspective of storytelling. So what are these witch stories that we have been told? How does it matter what we have been told? Um, Terry Pratchett, in his works, and we read them in my witches class, The Weird Sisters, Witches Abroad. Terry Pratchett is the creator of Discworld, the fantasy of Discworld. And he has come up with the theory of narrative causality. And he has this quote in Witches Abroad where he says, people think that stories are shaped by people. In fact, it is the other way around. And their very existence overlays a faint but insistent pattern on the chaos that is history. This quote forms the basis of a lot of the learning that goes on in my classrooms when we are studying witches. Granny Weatherwax, who is the crone in Witches Abroad, you have Nanny Ogg, and you have Margaret, who are the maiden and the mother. And Granny Weatherwax says, find the story. She believed that the world was full of story shapes. If you let them, they controlled you. But if you studied them, if you found out about them, you could use them. You could change them. And our understanding, and hence these images that you're seeing in the background on this Creative Cloud presentation, our interest is in seeing how these stories about witches have controlled their narratives and how they have broken free of those narratives and rewritten or taken charge of the stories that have been told about them. In that context, of particular interest, again, to me, and it should be to you, because Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie is one of the most fantastic speakers and writers. Her novel Americana is of you find fascinating too. But Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, this is her TED talk called "The Danger of the Single Story." And in this TED talk, she refers to a lot of the stories that she heard growing up and stories that have been told to her and stories that she had heard. So there are a lot of, it's full of personal stories. And the most important thing that she says is stories matter. Many stories matter. So if you're watching this, I think it's in the 17th minute, that she comes up with. Stories have been used to dispossess and to malign, but stories can also be used to empower and humanize. The entire TED Talk is against the danger of single stories, and basically talking about the need for multiple stories and hence multiple perspectives and making room for them. And so when she says stories matter, many stories matter. It's important that many voices are heard rather than the one dominant voice that controls the discourse, in this case about witches. She concludes this TED Talk by saying, when we reject the single story, when we realize that there can never be a single story about any place, we regain a kind of paradise. And she's in this case, she's referring to Alice Walker and her reference to how we regain paradise when we share their storytelling. But this has her whole concept of storytelling, along with Terry Pratchett's, has helped me provide the framework for these for the work that I do with regard to witches and their representation and the courses that I teach. Because our interest is to understand how these stories about witches have been created, where they're coming from. So we will be looking at the historical construction of these narratives and then the literary construction. So a little bit of history, some of it may be familiar to you. We want to some important dates to keep in mind when we go into the historical stories pertaining to witches. Important dates would be the peak of witch trials and fatalities in Europe between 1560 and 1630. This was followed by a kind of declining period between 1650 and 1750 in Europe. The Salem witch craze is happening in 1692. It lasted just over a year, so it started at the beginning of 1692 and concluded by the summer of 1693. Fueling the witch craze in Europe was the publication of Malleus Maleficarum. This work, which translates into the Hammer of Witches, published in 1486-87, coincided with the full functionality of the printing press, which was invented by mid 15th century, and by 1480 it was fully functional. So we had more than 20 to 25 editions of Malleus Maleficarum that were distributed at that time. Malleus Maleficarum is of particular importance because it became the handbook for witch hunters. It was used to identify witches. It was the work itself was set up in three parts, talked about the reality of sorcery. In part one, talked about the practice of, or questioned the practice of sorcery in part two, and actually went on to lay down the procedures for prosecution of witches in part three. The enormous popularity of Malleus was practically guaranteed not only to its authoritative appearance, but also to its extremely wide distribution. The moral backing had been provided, as Ben Yehuda says, for a horrible, endless march of suffering, torture, and human disgrace inflicted on thousands of women. An example of the pain for pay ethos of the European witch hunts is what is called the tariff for torture. It was a document which standardized price list for such gruesome services as terrorizing by showing the instruments of torture, and that was priced at 1 Reichstaler. Putting in the pillory, branding, and whipping was priced at 2 Reichstaler. Cutting out the tongue entirely was 5 Reichstalers, and breaking alive on the wheel was 4, just 1 Reichstaler less. Witch hunting, wrote the historian Rosenhoff Province, was self-sustaining and became a major trade, employing many people, all battening on the savings of the victims. And so we're looking at the business of witch hunts rather than just the unfortunate case of a few women being identified and prosecuted at that time, looking at thousands of these. And when we say women, there were men, but largely we're looking at 85% of those who were accused and tried and killed were identified as women. One theory, this whole understanding of feminist take on witch hunts has interesting stories. And again, there is not a single story in this regard either. One theory popularized by Barbara Ehrenreich and Deirdre English was in 1973 in their pamphlet Witches, Midwives, and Nurses, and where they said that midwives were especially likely to be targeted in the witch hunts because apparently they were threatening the authority of medical practitioners. However, this has been strongly refuted since in the research that followed, and the research that followed, both Gibbons and Diane Perkis in particular, clarified that being a licensed midwife actually decreased a woman's chances of being charged, and midwives were more likely to be found helping witch hunters, interestingly, than being victimized by them. The medieval witch hunts have long been depicted as part of a war against women conducted exclusively or overwhelmingly by men, especially by men in positions of authority. Deborah Willis notes, more polemical feminist accounts are likely to portray the witch as a heroic proto-feminist resisting patriarchal oppression and a wholly innocent victim of a male-authored reign of terror. In fact, however, the stigmatizing, victimizing, and murdering of these witches is more accurately seen as a collaborative enterprise between men and women. there were women who were also, as we would see even in the Salem witch trials, who were very much contributing to the identification of witches as, or identification of women as witches. The historical record suggests that both men and women found it easiest to fix these fantasies of witchcraft and turn them into horrible reality when they were attached to women. And so it was convenient not just for men, but also for the women to do so. Briggs, whose research I'm citing here, adds that the most informal accusations were made by women against other women and only leaked slowly across to the men who controlled the political structures of local society. More has been added to this theory of the business or the enterprise of witch hunts by Silvia Federici, who in her more recent work, 2018, it's called Witches, Witch Hunting and Women, in which she talks about the rise of capitalism and ties that to witch hunts. And she says the Black Death of the mid-14th century had decimated population levels across Europe. As a result of the subsequent shortages of people, peasants became empowered. And not only did the scarcity of labor give them the upper hand, but the spectacle of employers competing for their services strengthened their sense of self-value and erased centuries of degradation and subservience. The witch hunt for Federici is part of a process of primitive accumulation. While people were driven off land and lost their access to the commons, men gained control over women and their bodies. The witch hunt deepened the division, says Federici, between women and men, teaching men to fear the power of women, and destroyed a universe of practices, beliefs, and social subjects whose existence was incompatible with the capitalist work discipline, thus redefining the main elements of social reproduction. In other words, witch hunt was an essential aspect of the establishment of capitalist social relations of production. These were the historical stories regarding witch hunts in Europe, in medieval Europe. From there, when we come down to closer to home and we look into the witch hunts and the witch craze pertaining to the Salem witch trials, there is also a video, and I hope we can put that in chat. And in this video, they trace the brief history of the Salem witch trials and the timeline of the Salem witch trials. January of 1692, we have Samuel Parris, the minister in Salem village, Samuel Parris's daughter, Elizabeth Parris, and his niece, Abigail Williams. They're 9 and 11 each. And they are sick with convulsions, and after a month of home remedies, when nothing could be when their condition did not improve or the disease could not be identified, they were said to have been bewitched. And the first person who was accused was Tituba, whose story we will come to in just a little bit. Tituba then went on to identify other witches. Tituba, under torture, confessed to the practice of witchcraft, and then she pointed out Sarah Good and Sarah Osborne, and then they further identified others. Altogether, there were about 200 who were identified as witches in the Salem witch trials. And of them, 20 lost their lives, 20 were tried, and 19, I think I have the detail on 19 were the affected girls accused the first 3 victims, and several other died in prison. So altogether, we had 19 victims who were hanged at the Proctor's Ledge near Gallows Hill, and 1 person was tortured to death. And of those 19, of those 20, 19 were women, 18 or 19, because there is some dispute also with regard to, there was 1 man and there was possibly a dog. And so, but we're still looking at about 18 out of 20 for sure who were women who were tried and hanged at that time. There are, again, several theories because regarding the Salem witch trials, theories pertaining to the rise of medicine relate, or theories with regard to the connection between witch hunts and in medicine also take us back to the European witch hunts. And even then, these theories or these stories of medical practice, the rise of medicine had been tied to the rise in witch hunts. Witches' potions have also been connected to modern medicine. Perhaps the most striking example of witchcraft's influence on medicine comes from psychotropic plant compounds associated with flying ointments. These were salves reportedly created as magical aids during the height of the European witch hunting craze in the 15 and 1600s. In 1545, Spanish physician Andres Laguna provided an account of one such ointment found at the residence of an elderly couple suspected of witchcraft. A jar half filled with a certain green unguent, with which they were anointing themselves, was composed of herbs, which are hemlock, nightshade, henbane, and mandrake. Some of these plants proved poisonous at high doses, but some also contain a tropane alkaloid called hyoscine. Native Americans used a hyoscine-rich plant called thornapple as a local anesthetic because at higher doses, hyoscine can cause delirium and hallucinations. Whether Abigail and Elizabeth had used some of these, had been given some of these potions, and whether those were causing the hallucinations or the convulsions, or whether it was the result of a fungus-related poisoning, which is what ergotism conveys. Ergotism is the poisoning caused by a fungus associated with rye, and rye was the staple grain of Salem at that time. Toxicologists now know that ergot, contaminated food, can lead to convulsive disorder. There were other theories about Salem Village versus Salem Town. When we say Salem witch trials, we don't. If you look at the map of Salem at that time, Salem Village was larger than Salem Town, and Salem Village produced most of the crops and occupied more land and owned more land. However, Salem Town controlled the price of crops, and Salem Town insisted on the appointment of Samuel Parris as their reverend, which the villagers seriously contested and challenged. That is also about the time of the witch accusations that are happening in Salem. Interesting how all of these stories provide insight into what could have happened. And the interesting fact is that there is no single story among all of these that stands out. These are various theories and various approaches to understanding why whatever happened at that time, and in a matter of maybe 15 months, the witch craze that we still remember, what could have led to those factors. Of those Salem witches who were identified, the first one and the only colored one was Tituba. The historic representation of Tituba that we know from an article published in the Journal of Black Studies by Vida Smith Tucker, in that she notes that Tituba's master, Reverend Samuel Parris, understandably wanted to distance himself from any suspicion because he's the one who had brought Tituba as a slave from from Barbados. Tituba testified that the devil appeared to her as a tall, white-haired man from Boston wearing black, very much like Samuel Parris. Tituba's description implicated a clergyman, and Reverend Parris was, after all, responsible for bringing Tituba to Salem Village. He, if anyone, should have known the potential evil a slave of African and Indian origins. Tituba's origins are also, there are many stories about that too. Some retellings see her as being Native American, others see her as having African origins, they see her as coming from the Caribbean, they see her as belonging to Barbados. So many stories again about where she is from. So Samuel Parris should have known the potential evil a slave of African and Indian origins might possess. He had to remove himself from Tituba's diabolical influence. And so he did so by refusing to pay her jail fees. After 13 months in jail, a non-named person came forward and paid £7 for Tituba's release and removed her from the site of the tragedy forever. 4 years later, when one of the judges, 12 jurors, and many of the accusers publicly repented for their mistakes, Tituba was not present to receive redress. And what we know historically then in these historical stories about Tituba is that Tituba just vanished. We know that she went to prison. We know that she did not die because she confessed to having practiced witchcraft on the girls. But she just vanished from the historical records. No one came to claim her. No one, as a slave, she had no estate to be restored. So, to others without estates, the cost of imprisonment, here lies the irony, not only were they accused of witchcraft, but when they were imprisoned, they had to pay for their own imprisonment. And so Tituba, being a slave, had no estate of her own. So the cost of imprisonment was reimbursed, but neither Tituba's nor her new owner's name appears on the list of those who were compensated. So we just don't know who paid for her release and where she went. These glaring absences have had a curious effect. Rather than extinguishing Tituba from history, they have given her a permanent, though tarnished, historical presence that has survived for over 3 centuries. Tituba is remembered today as a confessed witch. She cast spells on the innocent Elizabeth and Abigail. The Salem judges relentlessly pursued those whom Tituba implicated in her testimony, but even they did not know what to do with her. Due to her confession, they were unable to put her to death, and due to their presumption of her irreversible degeneracy, they were unable to tolerate her presence in the village. Tituba still occupies a place at the center of our memory, and so her story has been retold in many forms in works of literature. And so one of the more canonical works of literature where Tituba appears is Arthur Miller's Crucible, published in 1953. It explores the Salem witch trials and includes an analysis of Tituba Indian, that's what she's called. She's considered to be an African Barbadian slave indicted of witchcraft and in 1692 sentenced to hang. Tituba basically just gets about one scene at the end of Act One, and it is the scene where she confesses in her broken English. She says, "He say, Mister," and she's talking about how the devil has forced her to write, and so this is part of her confession. "He say, Mister Paris must be killed. Mister Paris no goodly man. Mister Paris mean man." And no gentleman. And he bid me rise out of my bed and cut your throat. I tell him, no, I don't hate that man. I don't want to kill that man. But he say, you work for me, Tituba, and I make you free. I give you pretty dress to wear and put you way high up in the air, and you go and fly back to Barbados. And I say, you lie, devil, you lie. And then he came one stormy night to me and he said, look, I have white people belong to me. And I look, and there was goody good. This particular phrasing, this quote from the Crucible, has led to very interesting interpretations. And in response to this, for instance, when we talk in a minute about Maurice Conde's I, Tituba, Black Witch of Salem, you have a very interesting portrayal of Tituba. She speaks eloquently. I, Tituba, Black Witch of Salem is Maurice Conde's work, published in 1986 in French and then translated in English in 1992. A major work in both the feminist tradition as well as in terms of rescuing Tituba from history, and at the same time speaking back to this kind of portrayal in the Crucible. They have taken subsequent rewritings of Tituba's narrative, have taken this admission of guilt and used that to portray Tituba as someone who, when pushed into a corner, retaliates. And the broken English changes completely in I, Tituba, Black Witch of Salem, and you have her speaking most poetically and eloquently. So they have almost, and particularly Conde has treated this as ironic that Miller should portray Tituba in this manner, as somebody who can be fooled so easily. There are other rewritings. Before we talk about Tituba a little bit more, there are other versions. You have a 1956 book by Anne Petrie, Tituba of Salem Village. It was more for children than enough. There is Tituba, Reluctant Witch of Salem, published in 1997 by Elaine Breslau, which divides Tituba's story into two, her roots in Barbados and then her life in the New World. Tituba appears also in the novel Calligraphy of the Witch in 2007 by Alicia Gaspar de Alba as an Arawak Native American, indigenous from Guyana, fluent in several languages. And so most of these retellings of Tituba's story have gone back and portrayed her as being, they're talking back to Crucible's or Miller's use of broken English and a broken identity to go along with that. And they have reconstructed Tituba's image. Now, the interesting part about Conde's presentation of Tituba is that on the one hand, dismissed from history, except only as a summary footnote, a slave originating from the West Indies and probably practicing hoodoo. And here we are having fun with the language. Tituba literally steps outside of totalizing history. And she says, I do not belong to the civilization of the Bible and bigotry. My people will keep my memory in their hearts and have no need for the written word. For Tituba, the witch is born with a superior gift of nature to communicate with the invisible world, to keep constant links with the dead, to care for others and heal. Conde redefines the witch through her portrayal of Tituba as the very epitome of infinity, incarnating the desire to transcend the self and experience the absolute other. She, interestingly, she transplants Hester, and if you remember Hester Prynne from the Scarlet Letter, into her text, and she also talks back to to Miller's Crucible, using a technique that we would consider metafictional, which draws attention to the constructed nature of the text as fiction. Tituba acknowledges the inadequacies of history to properly document this key figure in the Salem witch trials, and by extension highlights the inadequacies of master narratives with regard to minorities and oppressed groups. And so Conde says in an interview, for me, Tituba is not a historical novel. Tituba is just the opposite of a historical novel. I was not interested at all in what her real life could have been. I had a few precise documents, her deposition testimony. It forms the only historical part of the novel, and I was not interested in getting anything more than that. I really invented Tituba. And she does that by giving Tituba birth, by giving her parents, by giving her childhood, by showing her living alone, by showing her being trained by a wise woman named Mama Yaya, and by evolving into a witch through her life experiences. And Tituba ultimately becomes a freedom, an activist of sorts, and she's fighting for and fighting for the rights of the Maroons on her island. She moves from Barbados to the New World, and then she returns to Barbados and fights for, she calls her people. While Conde redefines Tituba as a heroine, Tituba is not a figure who's wholly convincing or admirable. She does not reinvent Tituba into this superhuman heroic figure who's out to avenge herself. Instead, her Tituba is full of vulnerabilities and mistakes, and it doesn't sound very convincing on many occasions. And this is indicative, as Jalal Zai says, of the postmodern impulses to tear down heroes and to challenge master narratives. We want the many perspectives. We want characters who who can be seen from various perspectives and who have many dimensions. From there, we move on to the telling of the representation of witches in fairy tales. In fairy tales, particularly Brothers Grimm, children's and household tales from the 19th century, we we read of witches as mainly the evil queen or the stepmother. And so the Grimm's tales are littered with violent female bodies from the version of Cinderella Shottle with their chopped, the stepsisters with their chopped toes and blood dripping and all of that. Most fairy tales are considered to be the offsprings of authors such as Charles Perrault, French, Brothers Grimm, German, or Hans Christian Andersen, Danish. But the term fairy tale was actually coined by Madame or Countess d'Aulnoy, who invented the term conte de fées or fairy tale when she published her major collection in 1697-98. Few people know about the writings by these women creators of fairy tales. They were writing during the witch hunts and prior to the Grimms. They were writing alongside Charles Perrault, who was refining the folk tales and creating fairy tales for the court. In particular, almost 2/3 of the fairy tales composed during the 17th century can be attributed to this group of aristocratic women who sat together in the French salons and who shared stories. These retellings turned themselves into new versions of fairy tales. These female authors were able to criticize contemporary issues related to their gender, such as the intellectual compatibility between the sexes or the system of arranged marriages, in which, at its worst, women of their class were basically sold off to the highest bidder, or their right to exercise their intelligence and talents. They were not portraying the witch in any form. They were more concerned with with making self-conscious commentaries on themselves and on the genre that they were a part of. More recently, and while this is what we can learn about what they were doing, the kind of fairy tales, and so the discrepancy between the fairy tales written by the more well-known male writers of the time, where the evil women were the stepmothers and the queens, we have the female writers, aristocratic female writers of fairy tales, who had a completely different focus. And so the tales of witches, it's not that they're absent, but they're presented differently. And more recently, there's a book called The Island of Happiness. It features illustrations and an essay by the artist Natalie Frank. And the folklore podcast, which I hope we can put in the chat, called Literary Fairy Tales of Madame d'Aulnoy, actually talks about this work in conversation with Jack Zipes, one of the more notable scholars of fairy tales and folklore. This work, The Island of Happiness, contains a new English translation of The Tale of Nera, one of d'Aulnoy's earlier stories. And here we have a portrayal of Nera as a form of witch. She's almost a representation of Circe, and she kills scores of men. Anyone who saw her fell desperately in love with her. However, her pride and indifference made all of her lovers die until she falls for a man who's indifferent to her. According to Natalie Frank, these women in d'Aulnoy's tales are smarter and more vibrant than in those of her contemporaries, and more active and unusual than those of her antecedents. They flirt with boundaries and power dynamics between men and women, frequently connected to the relationship between animals, gods, and humans. They test physical and emotional frontiers in their journeys and conflicts. We do not hear of these women in the more popular fairy tales that have been handed down to us, the fairy tales that that most of us grew up reading. And in the Disney's transformation of these fairy tales, we see Disney going further back to the versions of Charles Perrault, but there is little mention of these writers of fairy tales, or female writers of fairy tales, whose representation of women took a completely different form. There have been subsequent writers similar to the countesses of the 17th century in the 20th century. And among them, we have Anne Sexton, whose work, Transformations, is a rewriting of the Grimm's tales in the form of poems. And she has transformed those fairy tales. Sylvia Plath in the posthumous collection Ariel in 1965, and then we have Olga Plumas herself. They have introduced a whole new tradition of retellings and revisions in their attempt to dissolve the misogynistic single stories that we had about witches. And so most of them particularly focus on the Snow White story. And in the revisions of the Snow White tale, whether it be in the European texts of the 19th or 20th centuries, or more recently the poem by Anne Sexton, the fate of the evil queen and the wicked stepmother or witch at the end offers new understanding of the role of the witch and the position of women in society. Largely, these retellings blur the role between the good woman and the bad woman, between the witch and the fairy. And so you have in a majority, because in all of the Grimm's tales, the witch had to die at the end. And the witch didn't just have to die, the witch also had to have a violent death, as in reinforcing or as in making sure that social order was restored, and it could only be restored after the violent removal of the elements that these witches represented. And so by blurring the boundaries between the good witch and we weren't talking of good witches back then, between the evil queen or the stepmother and the maternal mother, by blurring those boundaries, many of these rewritings of those fairy tales have kind of reinterpreted or recreated the role of women in a way, the happy ever after seems to be possible only after the brutal end of the witch. And yet, when you see the ending of Anne Sexton's poem, this is the end of the witch, and so she danced until she was dead, a subterranean figure, her tongue flicking in and out like a casket. Meanwhile, Snow White held court, rolling her china blue doll eyes open and shut, sometimes referring to her mirror, as women do. And for a minute, you see the evil queen reflected in Snow White. And such are the retellings of the fairy tale, particularly Snow White, Hansel and Gretel, and Cinderella too, and where we are merging or blurring the boundaries. Terry Pratchett has also done that in Witches Abroad, which uses the plot of Cinderella to explore the need for such happy endings. And so in Terry Pratchett's novel, Granny Weatherwax, the crone, is on a mission to prevent Cinderella's happy ending, which is being enforced by the fairy godmother Lilith, who's actually evil for forcing stories to follow the grooves that have been set already. Another version that we have, Helen Oyeyemi's Boy Snowbird, also kind of mixes up the roles. It is difficult to figure out who is really evil in that novel. And she intertwines the identities of the evil queen and Snow White, not only along the lines of gender, but also along the lines of their racial identities. Finally, we come to America's own fairy tale, which is The Wonderful Wizard of Oz, and which, for the first time, created the role of a good witch. But at the same time, it created the role of the Wicked Witch of the West, who again gets one chapter in The Wonderful Wizard of Oz. And that chapter is taken by Maguire and Gregory Maguire. And based on that, he recreated the life and times of the Wicked Witch of the West, 1995, which became the basis of the also popular musical Wicked in 2003. The novel is convoluted, complex in its plot structure, and it completely transforms the telling of the story of the Wicked Witch of the West. To begin with, he gives the Wicked Witch of West a name, then he transforms the perception of Oz itself. In his novel, Maguire reconstructs the magical and relatively benevolent land of Oz as a dark fascist world ruled by a cruel dictator, the wizard. Maguire recreates Baum's villain, the Wicked Witch of the West, as a young, misunderstood heroine named Elphaba. Elphaba's name is coined from L. Frank Baum's initials. In the original Baum books, the witch never had a personal name. She was just the Wicked Witch of the West. Elphaba, the green-skinned daughter of a religious man and his promiscuous wife, drops out of college and she becomes a freedom fighter for an underground resistance movement. That novel, or Maguire's Wicked, develops a complicated plot structure to portray the many experiences and events that lead to Elphaba becoming the Wicked Witch of the West. And she actually takes on the title. The ambiguous development of the plot questions the good evil dichotomy again, and it ends on a very interesting note. And that also kind of brings us to our end. And so Wicked ends with this quote, and after which, in the life of a witch, there is no after. And in the ever after of a witch, there is no happily. In the story of a witch, there is no afterward. She was dead, dead and gone. And there the wicked old witch stayed for a good long time. And did she ever come out? And it ends, the last words in the novel are, not yet. Again, leaving the door open for interpretations and for other stories to continue from there. Just because she hasn't come out yet doesn't mean that she will not come out, and therefore we have not yet as the final ending of the novel. My own final thoughts. At the end of Wicked, or close to the end, before the not yet, Maguire states, the story is told in so many ways, depending on who is doing the telling and what needs to be heard at the time. By subverting the power of the traditional singular narratives and allowing witches to take ownership of their own stories, these authors free the readers, even as they free the witches, from being trapped in predetermined ways of thinking. And so their purpose in retelling these stories is not just to here's something new to write about. It is to very actively participate in the process of storytelling and shaping narratives. And in liberating the witches, they are also liberating the readers from being trapped in what we call predetermined ways of thinking. In a more recent book called Literary Witches, a celebration of magical women writers, Taisia Kitaiskia and Katie Horan craft the stories of 30 women writers who inspire us to be creatively courageous. The connection that they make between witchcraft and the craft of writing practiced by these women writers who are acting in the role of witches in their writing is just fantastic. I would like to conclude by quoting from the preface to their book, where they say, because all artists are magicians and witches wield a special magic, witches and women writers alike dwell in creativity, mystery, and other works. They aren't afraid to be alone in the woods of their imaginations or to live in huts of their own making. They're not afraid of the dark. And so if you have found your witch costume and are going to be out and about this weekend for Halloween, I want to conclude by saying, don't be afraid of the dark.
Don't be afraid of the dark, definitely. Thank you so much. And part of the reason you aren't going to be afraid of the dark because there's so many Spider-Men running around. The number one costume is
I never thought the witches were competing with Spider-Man for the top spot.
No kidding, no kidding. And if it were a poll of teenagers, especially when it came to my kids, they were always zombies because it was the easiest thing. So if anybody has questions, go ahead and drop them in the chat. We have time to ask Aparna some questions about witches, witch narratives, things like that. I'm just going to throw one out at you. Obviously, the focus was with American witch stories. We touched on fairy tales, witch Germany, throughout Europe. Do you know when the first real story of witches really came to light, and what was that?
But the first real story of witches for all practical purposes, The Wonderful Wizard of Oz is considered the first American fairy tale. Because prior to that, the fairy tales were mostly European, Hans Christian Andersen, Grimm Brothers and all of that. And Disney came after. And so Wizard of Oz becomes the first American fairy tale. And to give him some credit, L. Frank Baum actually was the first to create the role of a good witch. So the good witch of the North, who's Glinda, was actually based on his mother-in-law. And whose mother-in-law, and L. Frank Baum's mother-in-law was a suffragist. And her name was Matilda Jocelyn Gage. And she wrote Women, Church, and State in 1893. She was one of the first to claim the witch as a symbol of feminine power. So this is L. Frank Baum's mother-in-law who inspires the creation of the Good Witch. So we owe him the Good Witch, but then we owe him the Wicked Witch too.
So somebody dropped in the chat. Just curious if you're familiar with Madeline Miller's take on Circe, somebody from Greek mythology.
I am, and I'm actually teaching it this semester. And we're having the most, we just started like a couple of weeks ago, and we're having the most interesting time reconstructing Circe's story, because we are not only tracing it back from chapter 10 of the Odyssey, of Homer's Odyssey, we are also looking at Margaret Atwood has a collection of poems on Circe. And so we're looking at those. We're looking at Eudora Welty's short story called Circe. So it's just interesting how many other stories of Circe are going around. And so, yes, we are definitely looking at it. I think we are really enjoying it too.
And people, a reminder, if you have a question for Aparna, drop it in the chat. So what major societal shift contributes to the resurgence of the representation of witches in literature and pop culture?
It has been interesting, hearing about witches because the parallel narrative in the social and political discourse has continued. We have heard of, there is an organization called Women's International Terrorist Conspiracy from Hell, which formed in 1968 in New York City around Halloween, and they helped the New York Stock Exchange and things like that. So, there is always that undercurrent. And then there is the constant reference. For instance, at that time, the Prime Minister of India, Indira Gandhi, had been called an old witch by Nixon. More recently, Hillary Clinton has been called the Grand High Witch. Even Michelle Obama has been called the ghetto witch. So, the witch terminology is just all around. We're always listening to the witches are always present. It's just that, and in literature, they've always had, Shakespeare's Macbeth opens with, and I think for most of us, that is the iconic image that we remember of the witches portion. And so it has, I think the preoccupation, and particularly thanks to the feminist movements, the first, second, third waves, all of those contributed to the resurgence of the witch stories, or interest in witches and their stories, and the need to read them and to talk about them.
So have you always had a fascination with witches? And if you did as a child, why?
I actually didn't. I'm just one of those who does not read any kind of mystery or horror. So for me, but my interest in witches is actually from this perspective of the othering of witches, and my interest in women and their portrayal. It's not so much from, I wasn't, I don't think I ever dressed up as a witch for Halloween. And so, but, I would see, and I would always be interested in, why they are portrayed the way that they are portrayed. So it took a few years, and then I think when The Danger of a Single Story came about, the interest in storytelling really provided my framework for interesting. But I've been interested in fairy tales before. And I think even when you start to really seriously read the fairy tales, you start noticing the stereotype. You start noticing that there is a difference between a real mother and a stepmother. And the stepmother is just getting a bad deal in those tales, and it didn't seem fair.
Stepmother's always getting the raw end of the stick. So final question, and then we'll wrap things up. Do men ever play a role in the witch stories?
So, just as I said in the presentation too, the majority of people who were accused were women, so 85% of them. But then it's not that women were not accusing. So women along, so it was an entire, almost a kind of enterprise. And men and women, people in positions of authority and interested in keeping the social political structure of the time were equally complicit. But when we talk about men, Gregory Maguire, L. Frank Baum, Terry Pratchett are all male writers who are very deliberately writing about witches and reinventing the perception of witches. So whenever we think witches are all about women and women writing about women, not necessarily so. And that is why I think it is important to read Pratchett and Maguire and all of these writers too, to say that they have created these characters.
Favorite witch, and then I promise I'll let you go. Who is your favorite witch?
Oh, you asked me who's my favorite witch. I would think ever since I discovered Tituba, I think she has been my favorite witch, because Tituba allows for so many narratives to come together. Tituba is the immigrant in the New World. Tituba is the first witch in the Salem trials. Tituba, and she's just so multidimensional. There is so much you can do with, and you don't know anything for sure. And I think that's what I like best, that there is always speculation. Anything can happen with your reading of Tituba. So, yeah, that is my favorite book, Tituba, Black Witch of Salem, and that is my favorite.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for taking time out of your schedule to be with us on this pre-Halloween webinar.
Thank you for having me.
You're so welcome. And just a reminder to tonight's audience, the webinar has been recorded and we will upload it onto our website tomorrow. If you're looking for a night filled with wine, beer, bourbon, join us on Sunday, November 6th for our 14th annual Uncork Education. We invite you to support scholarships through this fun event. Uncork features free wine and beer tasting, heavy hors d'oeuvres, silent live auction, Blazer Plinko, which is new this year, and bourbon tasting, which is also new this year. All that for $60, bourbon tasting an additional fee. Check out this year's auction items and register at alumni.uab.edu/uncork 2022. Also, come back and join us for other webinars. On Thursday, November 10th, we welcome Dr. Philip Wood for What Pet Parents Should Know About Obesity and Diabetes. Discover how that extra weight your chubby pet is carrying is more harmful than cute. And please note, this is a new date. Then on Wednesday, November 16th, join us for Beating the Burnout, Strategies for Finding Joy in Your Job and Life Again, as we welcome Dr. Megan Hayes. Feeling burned out? You're not alone. Dr. Hayes will discuss factors that contribute to burnout and what we can do to find joy again. Finally, new to our list is Charles in Charge. What's next for the British royal family? That's going to be on Tuesday, December 6th. Royal expert Rachel Birchfield will explore all things royals, including what King Charles III's reign is going to look like. We have 3 webinars set for 2023. Check all of these out at alumni.uab.edu/events. Finally, let us know how we're doing. The QR code coming up on your screen takes you to a short survey. Give us feedback about what you liked about tonight's webinar and suggestions for the future. Once again, thank you so much for joining us for tonight's webinar. Happy Halloween. And as always, go Blazers.